Welcome everyone and thank you for joining. An exciting discussion lies ahead of us on the positive roles that values have to play in our lives and how we can raise awareness on these and how we can communicate and engage in values to better communicate the many communities and relationships that we partake in daily. A simple awareness to trigger our actions and values can quite simply help increase our social and personal well-being. We hope today we can provide you with some insight into how you can inspire to include values into your everyday life.
I got my real insight into values talking to very small children, and I was searching for what would small children really understand by the term value. So I was talking with 6 and 7-year-olds, and we were doing all sorts of experimentation and really creative looking at what this word values means. And a little child looked up at me and he said, I think a value is something that guides us in some way, something that guides our thinking. And then he said, and then once we've got our thinking right, it then helps us in our behavior too. So I think a value is a principle that guides our thinking first, and then helps us in our daily lives, in our behavior. So it can be put as simply as that. The question is, as I look around the world at politicians, at business leaders, I always think, well, what is it that drives, what motivates these people? And really, at depth, it is their values that drives them, because innately, we have qualities. We have qualities of respect, love, compassion. And these basic human innate qualities are the ones the values that we need to nurture in our world, particularly at this time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. And to Andrew, why do values matter?
For me, values are inner truths that sort of resonate throughout our lives. They build our relationships and they help us build our position from which we view the circumstances that we encounter in our lives.
I'm just going to quickly interject and just to inform the audience that Andrew's had to call back in as we lost his connection. So Andrew, can you hear us?
I can indeed.
Perfect. I have a quick question for you, Andrew. Have you ever experienced values in practice in your work? And if so, how? Could you explain it? Give an example?
Well, yes, part of my counselling work is with people of all ages, but one of the areas is particularly with teenagers who hold their values very close to their chest and their hearts, I think. And so adolescence is particularly a time when people believe things absolutely, and they often deride the hypocrisy of, or the perceived hypocrisy of the adult world. And so finding their core values and using those as ways to engage them in positive ways where they change things powerfully makes a gigantic difference in their lives. So one of the things that we do is students create the future projects where young people take on an issue or of their choosing where they want to make a big difference in the world, and they just do it for a short period of time and enlist them in that. And the results have been remarkable because, of course, quite often things are done to young people rather than by young people. And when, of course, young people start to behave in ways that are compassionate or generous or caring, they start to define themselves that way. And so they start to realize that those values are within them already. And so it's like an unveiling, if you like, of the inner parts of themselves.
Is it fair to say that from the unveiling of their values from a young age, being aware to the concept of values is almost a predetermination of how they'll act in the future in some sort of way?
I think your values unfold as you develop an age. And so clearly, often as young children, we're very focused on our survival and we're probably fairly me-oriented. And then gradually we get to a point where we start to appreciate the position of other people and how we can relate to them. And so it's a process of learning what those values are that basically can guide our lives. And probably it's really only in our middle primary school years, which would be sort of 8, 9, 10 years of age, and we start to get a really powerful view of creating a difference. Then, of course, during adolescence, there's a moment, I think, in anyone's life when you have to kind of finally realize that you are the leader that you've been waiting for. And that moment is an incredibly important one, because if you keep waiting for somebody else to lead you, you're going to be waiting a long, long time. Whereas if you then start to think, well, how can I be influential and how can I empower other people to create a difference in the world, that's when you really start to develop as a human being.
Brilliant. And the same question to you too, Neil. How do you see engaging with values working in practice?
I think I'd like to refer, I know not all listeners will be focused on schoolwork, but I'd like to refer to a visit I made last Friday to a school in Lincoln in the UK, in which the school had deliberately made values a focus for everything that they do in the school. It was a values-based school. So the school has really thought through what values they want as a community. And what I then saw was that the children were able to articulate what those values actually mean. They had an understanding because they had been introduced to the vocabulary. My big thing is that society at large does not have the vocabulary of values. It doesn't understand words such as respect, tolerance. So we need to induct, all of us need to induct ourselves into an understanding of values.
So when children engage with this concept of values, this awareness of values, what difference does it make to their behaviour, not just in their education, but in society, in their everyday life?
I think what I've noticed, what I've observed in children, and is that they start to engage in what I've termed the wisdom cycle, so that there's an input of information, they will hear something, someone will ask them a question. Perhaps someone will insult them or say something that could disturb them. But people who have an understanding of values seem to build in a pause mechanism. So they hear what's going on, but then they go internal, and there's that pause while they think about the most appropriate response that they can give. And so what I am observing in people who are inducted into the language of values is that it gives them this pause facility, because they are using their internal world. They are doing something that I call being self-led, being really led by your prefrontal cortex, and that ability to integrate your brain so that you can give an appropriate response that isn't, as Andrew would talk about, because I've heard him talk about it, dependent on the limbic system suddenly kicking off with emotions. So that's a little insight there.
We'd love to hear more from Andrew on this topic. So to Andrew, how do you see engaging with values?
One of the ones recently that we've been working on here is with one of our colleagues, Peter Wiltshire. And it's an example of, let's say you bought a chair off a friend of yours for, let's say, £20, but you're able to sell it on eBay for £950. What's the right thing to do? And to give those sorts of examples and then to debate it through means that later on, when something similar occurs, you've taken that response out of the automatic part of our brain, the cerebellum, and you've taken it into the prefrontal cortex, where we can actually start to think about these and evaluate what's the best thing to do. You know, obviously weighing up the pros and the cons of various positions then helps you to kind of mature in terms of your thinking around that. And I find generally many people have never had the opportunity to do that.
And coming over to you, Terry, again, you've had extensive work with value-based education leading initiatives in Australia. When you put this into practice, did you see a positive advantage of using values in society?
Yes, absolutely. We dealt a lot in the early days with what I came to coin as the surprise effect. People were surprised that just going about schooling with a values focus could make such a difference. In the early days, some fairly simple stuff of just, making sure that an assembly was done in a particular kind of way with a particular kind of ambience, concentrating on the positive, the encouraging, the affirming, dealing with, some prickly issues as gently as possible rather than in a punitive kind of a way, and then taking that into the classroom and then, in many cases unpacking it with something like, today's value or the value of the month. Fairly straightforward sort of, not rocket science stuff. And yet very early on, people could see a difference in behaviour management issues, issues of attrition, things that could actually be measured. And then, of course, eventually some of the academic prowess also started to kick in. So we did a lot with the idea that it couldn't possibly be this simple. But in actual fact, I think the lesson in it is that it is. It is at one level a simple science. It is just people being their best selves in whatever they're doing. The world would be such a much better place if we all just thought about how we engage in our exchanges, all of our exchanges, a little smile, a little, a little bit of helpfulness just as we're passing people in the street. All of those things build a much better kind of an environment, and that's all about values.
The key for me, Andrew, is that so much of what we do as human beings is outside of our conscious awareness. And what I have observed is that when a community begins to focus on values, their awareness increases. If you take the Australian research, the first outcome of the research was that by thinking about values, you have greater awareness about your behavior, your thoughts. And so much that is happening in the world on the negative side, I believe often happens not intentionally, but because it's outside of awareness. So by inducting ourselves into a greater clarity about these words called values, it helps raise our awareness. Which everybody forgets, Nigel, is the relationship with themselves. I often ask, who's your best friend to people? And they will list Mary, John, Mohammed, or whoever it may be, who is their best friend. But I then say, well, who do you spend the most time with in your life? And it is, of course, yourself. So my own view is that yourself should become the best friend. But then the question should be asked, well, who is this self? Now, without getting into a lot of jargon or mystique, my own view is that we have a self which is an authentic self. That authentic self is the person I like when I'm being the person I like the best. It is that person who is out there and has the oxytocins flowing, as Andrew had been talking about. That person that's enthusiastic, that person that is compassionate, that person who has all those values. That's our natural, authentic self. But as children, we learn not to be authentic. We learn in our families and in community that being authentic sometimes isn't the best adaptation we can make to get to feel okay in our family, for instance. And the reason is that we are born into families where the adults are not really acting from their authentic selves because of the experiences they've had in their lives. So the great thing a child has to do is think, my gosh, how do I survive with this family? So the children adopt not an authentic self, but an adaptive self. So what happens with values is the values, when you start thinking about them, help to uncover again that authentic self. As Andrew said, trust is an innate value. Cooperation is. The young children only survive if they learn to cooperate very quickly. So we have those innate values, but also we have another set of values which I describe as shadow. And that's our selfishness, our greed, our jealousy, which is lurking there. So for any hope that we should have in the world, from my perspective, is how can we water those seeds of positivity which come about in positive human values rather than that other side. So when you look, for instance, now at the American election or the British Brexit experience, or what's happening in France with the movement of the nationalism, and I could go around the world looking at it. I could dip into Australian politics, but I won't. But wherever you have politics happening, or at the corporate level or at the government level, you have these two sides of values playing out. And I believe that by thinking about what is it in my real self that makes me truly feel this wonderful thing that I can experience as a human being, which I think is the birthright of every human being. It's when you have that understanding of yourself, which then can interact with other people's authentic self. Then you can build relationship, and then you can lead to a world that's a different sort of place, and corporations. So.
Brilliant. I actually have a question. It's just going back to what Neil said earlier about your inner values that then move over to the shadow values. Could you just explain a little bit more to the audience? Because obviously we don't have, well, I certainly don't have the knowledge as to what these shadow values and how these can affect, for example, education or society.
Yes, I think another word rather than shadow is limiting. What limits our ability to form relationship with other people in a successful way? So as Andrew said, we build up teams, because there's no doubt that working as a team, you release the creative dynamic of each individual within that team. So if you look at some of the most successful companies of the world, they really know how to release that creative dynamic. And it happens when we do focus on positive human values rather than the values that can be described as limiting. Now, the Barrett Values Foundation has looked at values that drive societies and governments, and they have shown that the most successful governments in the world are those that are looking to promote positive values rather than limiting ones. And it's interesting that the Barrett Foundation has actually given several governments an alert when they've done a survey to show that the number of values in their society is tipping over far too much to the limiting ones such as over bureaucracy, for instance. The bureaucratization of society has increased in the last 20 years phenomenally. So people in health service, police, etc., feel that they are governed by too much paperwork, to put it simply. And so they have forecasted, for instance, when the banking crisis happened. They've also forecast how the UK will have a tremendous blip. They've also forecast the American situation. Once you start looking at values, it gives you an incredible indication of the health of a society. If you go back to cave people's days, which we all come from, then shadow was very useful. You know, that selfishness, that ability to take rather nasty decisions sometimes was a benefit. And so genetically, we've been programmed with that. But in the 21st century, that programming is not useful to us. It is destructive. And somehow humanity has to say, how now, Kira, do we fix on these more positive? And your generation, Kira, and the generations below you need desperately to get into this area of values in the practical form of values, because that is the key to how we help our planet in terms of environment, in politics, in social needs, housing. Everything boils down to what values do you have?
Yeah, no. So it's such an obvious concept that you do realise you do in everyday life overlook, and it's quite worrying when you sit here. For me, I'm sitting here and I'm like, wow, gosh, it's eye-opening. It really is. Brilliant. I'm just going to finish up now, and I would just like a 1 or 2 line sentence of why people might want to engage. I know that last about 5 to 10 minutes is what we've been explaining, but just in a real punchy way, just that will stick with us as to why we should engage with values. Andrew, I'll start with you.
I don't think you cannot engage with values. You're going to do it one way or the other. But the effect of engaging with them is twofold. The first one is you'll have better relationships in your world. And the second one is you'll be more aware of what you want in the world and more likely to get it. So good reasons to engage in values.
Perfect. Thank you. And to Neil.
What I think is behind education generally, corporate world, everything is the flourishing of humanity. How do we ensure that human beings on this planet can flourish? I look at my own grandchildren now, not just children, but grandchildren, and I think, how can they flourish? There is no other way that we can bring about the flourishing of humanity unless we focus on values.
Brilliant. And now to you, Terry.
Think of it as a supremely selfish exercise. If you learn to respect, to trust, to show mercy, to forgive, you will be way happier than doing anything else.
And lastly, Nigel.
Values is the way that humans interact with each other, and there's loads of evidence to show that the way we perceive other people is the way we live our own lives. And if we can't treat other people well, we're not going to be treating ourselves well. If we can treat ourselves with compassion, we'll treat other people with compassion. There's no other way in a human sense that we can operate. So engaging with values raises awareness of these key components of how we understand our own motivations, how we understand other people's motivations, how we relate to each other. And from a personal, from a corporate, and from a social perspective, engagement with values, as everyone else has said, is the key to a flourishing and successful future.
Brilliant. So I'd just like to thank you all again for joining us today. You've given us some fantastic insight to the power of values, and you've outlined many varied ways in which we as individuals, not only as organisations and institutions and governments, but mainly as individuals, if one starts, it's almost like a butterfly effect, and how we can benefit and engage from this consciously in our personal and corporate self. So for all those that are interested, the series of articles on the relationship quotient that Andrew was talking about is and can be found on the World Values Day website. Just simply type into Google World Values Day and you can find us there right at the top of Google. Andrew and Neil's work on resilience in schools is explained in more detail on the value-based education website, and again just type value-based education into Google and you can find us there. So it leaves me to thank you, the audience, for watching this conversation. I hope it inspires you. It certainly inspired me. It's made me think a lot. It's opened my mind up a lot, and I do think that it is our place as a generation and following generations to actually engage in this, and it's the only way for us to create a better future for our communities, our relationships, and ourselves. Like Neil was saying, the inner self has to be our best friend. So yeah, I hope that we've we've given you a small insight into the world that values can do for your life. So this is Kira Dempsey Branch reporting from Brighton. Thank you so much.